Revealed. This can't be right, can it? Was this the last wrestling game to come from a studio that made some absolute legends of the genre? This weird mishmash of one-on-one fighting game, anime and basic wrestling was the last thing AKI Corporation made in that most wonderful world of sweaty men dressing up and pretending to fight. But it's what happened. September 2008 saw the release of Kinnikuman Muscle Grand Prix 2 Tokomori on PlayStation 2, an expanded version of 2007's game of the same name, but without the Tokomori bit. It was the final wrestling game AKI would make, and hardly anyone even noticed. It was 1995 when AKI Corporation first formed, then under the rather fantastic name of The Man Breeze, which you could read as an admission Ric Flair is Tyler's dad. This new studio would be headed up by one Shuji Yoshida, formerly of Human Entertainment, creators of the Fire Pro series of grappler games. So, a breakaway republic of wrestling experts dead set on forging ahead with their own pure vision beyond the limitations of what they'd done on Fire Pro? Not exactly. Yoshida himself never worked on a Fire Pro title at Human, while the staff on AKI's eventual wrestling output only included a handful of devs with credits on previous Fire Pro titles. And frankly, names like Takeshi Kodama, Kenji Kimura and Hiroya Tamura weren't exactly high up the pecking order at Human to begin with. The intention was there for the Man Breeze to make wrestling games though, and that it did. Virtual Pro Wrestling released for the PS1 in September of 1996 and set in place a fair few elements that would remain a constant through the Man and AKI's next few years. First up, it was published by Asmic Ace Entertainment, a company that would be a valuable partner to AKI over the coming years. Second, it showed the first furtive steps the Man Breeze would take with its wrestling engine, moving away from the straightforward energy bar-based arcade brawler style of many previous wrestling games and into that of a slower, more tactical approach. Virtual Pro Wrestling also acted as the studio's first step into the realm of licensed wrestling titles. While the original release only made its way to Japanese shores, it was picked up shortly afterwards by publisher THQ, coated in World Championship Wrestling branded, and re-released in the West under the name WCW vs. The World. The presentation, the wrapping, was different, but the underlying game the same. That is to say, alright, okay, decent. Not something you'd specifically see much potential in, but not offensively bad. It certainly wasn't a legend, but it was a start. To really get things moving though, a change would be needed. The details weren't clear, reports were light on detail, the police kept stum, but in 1997, the Man Breeze died. While a cold case is no cause for celebration, this particular passing brought with it a rebirth. AKI Corporation, the studio's new name, a less daft-sounding title to help set the team up on the worldwide stage. Did THQ order the hit on the Man Breeze? I've no idea, and to date this video tremendously, I've just finished watching Tiger King, so it feels right to accuse someone or something of murder and try to get the internet to believe me. Anyway, I digress. A change of name additionally brought with it a change of approach, as THQ ordained AKI's next wrestling game would be WCW branded from the get-go, and that it would jump to the Nintendo 64. But this is where it got a bit mixed up. The eventual release of WCW vs NWO World Tour arrived in November 1997, with the Japanese version of the game, entitled Virtual Pro Wrestling 64, landing a month later. It wasn't a port, though. THQ wasn't involved. Ostensibly the same, or at least a very similar game, it played similarly to the Western release, but featured a vastly different roster, a different look and atmosphere, and was, dare I say it, much more suited to Japanese wrestling fans. Almost as if AKI and Asmic knew what they were doing. Why is this an important facet? Well, because it showed AKI was always working with some level of autonomy here, and not being crushed underfoot by the power of a publisher or the strength of a license. Just look to Yuke's to see how badly that can end up. No, AKI's move into the world of World Championship Wrestling was a happy accident attached to a studio making great wrestling games, and not a license being acquired and a studio being forced to make games based on it. It was organic, and it was something being done with passion, and it showed. Another WCW vs NWO title, Revenge, followed in 1998 and went down incredibly well. It's telling that even though the WWF was the dominant wrestling brand of the day, it was a WCW wrestling game that was getting everyone excited. The WWF games Acclaim was pumping out were lacking at best, and it was genuinely one of those rare cases where the better product outdid the marketing spend and general popularity contest aspect of things. That said, there was a lot more money in the world-conquering WWF than there was in the already faltering WCW, so I would assume THQ bit WWF's hand off when the license came up to make games for the brand. AKI made the publisher-ordained jump, switching to Vince McMahon's house of damn it, but fortunately keeping things largely how they had been before the jump. The same high quality of Grappy Graps maintained with the release of WrestleMania 2000 late on in 1999, and brilliantly, Aki and Asmik's same commitment to making a home region specific version of a wrestling game continued in January of 2000 with the release of Virtual Pro Wrestling 2. Once again, this spin-off was more than just a variant that used the Japanese language, instead bringing with it local stars big and small, different play modes, even, as with VPW 64, an entire different wrestling, well, shoot-fighting style. It was and is still the wrestling game of choice for plenty, especially the sorts who've never played it but want to sound cool, and it'll forever have a place in the history books as one of the best all-round representations of a sport. It's an entertainment game. That's what tends to happen when you make something with passion and care. Weird, right? I won't diss WWF No Mercy though, I adore that game and in many ways actually prefer it to Virtual Pro Wrestling 2. It still represents my period of wrestling when I was the right age, and that element mixed with the experience and skill that comes from a studio having honed its systems to near perfection over the few years prior, made it an absolute standout for me and those who didn't still harp on about the game-killing save bug 20 years later. It was a massive fault, I know, but THQ made good on it by having it fixed and helping those impacted by replacing their copy of the game free of charge, so let's let that one die, shall we? Anyway, VPW2 is the connoisseur's choice, of that I have no doubt. But I will argue till I'm redder in the face than Daniel Bryan was of chest in the Greatest Royal Rumble that No Mercy was Aki's all-round best wrestling game. And then, just as suddenly as we'd hit this new rhythm, just as this Aki-Asmik THQ partnership had hit its stride, it all got super kicked in the face. THQ saw management change in the early 2000s, and the close relationship shared between the US publisher and Aki in Japan quickly began to sour. Where previously Aki had been allowed to pretty much do what it wanted, so long as it didn't, say, mess up licensing deals or, I don't know, go on a wacky racist rant on some proto-YouTube platform or anything, it was fine. As producer Sanders Keel said in a podcast I'm linking below, he basically babysat Aki with regards to these sorts of things, and as far as he was concerned, the studio could do what it wanted as long as THQ approved it, and he tended to approve things. But it changed. Those established relationships gave way to a new set of corporate overseers, and with the new bunch of suits came a renewed focus on Aki's inability to meet deadlines or stick to budgets. Not good enough in the belt-tightening world of corporateness. Who cares if Aki produced some of the most beloved wrestling games of all time and was at the time being recognised for doing just that? What mattered was towing the line and making sure everything fit neatly into THQ's accounting spreadsheet columns, and really, Aki didn't help itself by pushing to be allowed to work on the then new PS2, favouring Sony's new machine over the ailing N64 or then non-existent GameCube. The problem came from the fact THQ had that covered. Yuke was handling WWF games for the PlayStation. Aki was thus positioned as unreliable, as unwilling to do the work it was there to do, and as unable to function smoothly with management. It was mainly bollocks, of course, and there was a lot more to it than the suits would ever bother to try and recognise, but like so many NWO logos before it, the writing was hastily spray-painted on the belt. Aki was dropped, and THQ moved ahead with its wrestling games without the best wrestling game development team out there. What happened next was just ridiculous and proves the universe is an uncaring bastard of a git. EA stepped in. No, it's not going where you assume. The publishing giant didn't chew up and spit out Aki. It instead put the studio to work on the WCW license it had itself picked up a couple of years prior. Whatever the game was called, it was set to release on PS2, maybe GameCube too, with AKI at the helm and EA's millions behind it. Only for the WWF to purchase WCW in 2001 and the entire project got cancelled before anyone saw anything of it. No, those magazine scans are of what became WCW Backstage Assault, not an AKI project. Work had been done though, and something would rise from the ashes. But before that, AKI did return to the ring with another licensed tie-in and another wrestling game on a Nintendo format. Ultimate Muscle Legends vs New Generation released in November 2002, though under its Japanese title because it was in Japan, and now I'm going to embarrass myself, Kinnikuman Nisei New Generation vs Legends. Ultimate Muscle tied in with the anime and manga of the same name and offered a wrestling game that brought into it far more arcade-focused elements, headbutting opponents into the ropes, say, or eschewing top rope acrobatics for a more standard jump button, maybe. It was a step away from the more simulation-ish basis of No Mercy and that game's predecessors, and offered an early peek into the direction AKI would be heading down in the years to follow. There were even a couple of tweaked and updated versions of Ultimate Muscle on PS2 and PSP, and in fact, eagle-eared fans will already have realised this particular wrestling odyssey ended with the Kinnikuman license. But that's getting ahead of myself, because EA wasn't about to let AKI's hard work on a wrestling game engine go to waste. Yes, WCW was for all intents and purposes dead, but the publisher had another idea in mind. Wait, no, that was dead too. TNA, no, didn't exist yet. WWF? No, stuck with THQ till the publisher died. Well, what then? What could EA do with a dev studio that had half made a licensed wrestling game and was famed for its ability to make amazing licensed wrestling games? Why, it gave AKI the chance to create another amazing licensed wrestling game. Just one with an unexpected dollop of rap smothering the whole thing. Def Jam Vendetta landed on PS2 and GameCube in 2003 and saw rappers and hip-hop artists like Redman, Ghostface Killah and Ludacris face off in brutal street fights in some ridiculous method, man, of trying to make them all look, well, hard or something. It was roundly mocked for being a daft idea, the sort of thing invented by grey-faced middle-aged men trying desperately to tap into what the kids think is cool. And then people played it and realised it was a proper AKI wrestling game, just in another rapper. With a W. Well, most realised that was the case at least. It will forever be one of the strangest sidesteps in all of gaming history, but there we go, a Def Jam branded fighting game became the successor to No Mercy. Some of the complexity of the last WWF game had fallen by the wayside, no create a fighter, 4 moves from a grapple instead of 8, that sort of thing, and there were obviously no actual wrestlers involved, but it's impossible to argue with a straight face that Def Jam Vendetta wasn't a wrestling game. And it continued. In 2004, EA doubled down and allowed AKI to make another wrestling game in disguise with the same license, titled Def Jam Fight for NY. This one might have featured Henry Rollins, thus making it one of life's greatest games, but in reality it did mark another step by AKI away from that pure pro wrestling output the world loved it for. It wasn't just the ever more watered down complexity in those controls, it was the feel of things, the general focus, moving as it did to more of an outright brawl than a technical grabfest. While things trundled along with the PSP release of Fight for NY, the takeover in 2006, the decision had clearly already been made at EA, and AKI was dropped. Def Jam continued, but just like with THQ continuing to release Nintendo wrestling games without AKI, it all went a bit wrong. And sadly for all of us, Def Jam was the last time we got what you could realistically call a wrestling game from one of the true great wrestling game studios. But it wasn't AKI's last wrestling game. Not really. So, 2006, the arcade. Banpresto holding the purse strings. We need a coin-up tie-in for Kinnikuman, they say, probably pronouncing it properly. Whoever could we get on the hook for this grandest of tasks? AKI, having already worked on a few tie-ins for the anime, was the natural choice. I don't know this, I'm just assuming because it's what happened. And with the game being set for Namco's System 256 arcade hardware, it could be ported to the PS2 with ease. A game based on a wrestling property made by a studio that had proven itself more than adept at making licensed wrestling games for powerful arcade hardware but also easily translatable to the home. brilliant. Only problem being Kinnikuman Muscle Grand Prix wasn't a wrestling game. Not really. None of the series was. 4 versions of Grand Prix released over a couple of years. 2 appeared on arcade first, then were ported to PS2, and all of them pretty much of a type. Said type being a 2D one-on-one fighter masquerading as a 3D fighter, masquerading as a wrestling game of sorts. It was an arcade game with a smidge of the wrestling engine depth you expected from AKI. So while you could dash up and get into some thwacking each other multi-hit combos, there were plenty of grapples involved, plenty of holds, and plenty of silly pile drivers I'd be too scared to see attempted in real life. But none of them were wrestling games. Not really. Of course, this led to that last game, the first you saw in this video, Kinnikuman Muscle Grand Prix 2 Tokomori, in September 2008. It's better to say this was a wrestling-themed fighting game rather than a wrestling game, and marked AKI Corporation's final attempt at making something in the form of a wrestling game, but not really. AKI's output since No Mercy had drifted, with a lack of real-world pro wrestling licenses necessitating the move towards more traditional fighting games and away from the purity of the sweaty men dressing up and pretending to fight. Even though Kinnikuman was wrestling-themed, its anime and manga roots precluded any games from maintaining much in the way of realism, so a straight wrestle game would never have worked. Moving toward the more over-the-top and arcadey style of the one-on-one fighter just made sense. A relatively niche license, a Japan-only release for all of the Grand Prix series, a mixture of not quite pure fighter and nowhere near pure grapple 'em up, this was how it all ended. This was the last time AKI ever made anything resembling a wrestling game. What happened beyond that point? Well, it's the stuff of legend, at least to people like me. It's fair to say AKI wasn't exactly top of the pile by 2008, and studio chiefs knew something needed to be done to keep the company viable. By the time AKI's last ever wrestling game, but not really, released, the steps had already been taken. The studio was operating simultaneously under the name Syn Sophia, and just 1 month after Tokomori released, the sinning side of the studio brought one Style Savvy, or Style Boutique depending on where you are in the world, to Nintendo DS. It's not something I want to dwell on. It's not something I'm even going to raise any sort of issue with. AKI wasn't treated well by THQ or EA, and after interest dried up in the studio making more wrestling games of any sort, or more Yakuza spin-offs on PSP with effectively wrestling gamer-like combat in them, what was it supposed to do? Just curl up and die? Nope, much better to curl up and die. Wait, that's a visual pun. Also, Style Savvy's about clothes, not haircuts. Damn it! I sincerely hope this vaunted AEW game does indeed come about with AKI doing the heavy lifting. The team will have changed, of course, but the studio still has the same leadership as ever, and with Shuji Yoshida still at the helm, we could finally get that proper No Mercy sequel we've always wanted, just with a different Fed behind it. I've been patient for decades. We all have. Isn't it about time AKI got the treatment it deserved, and we got the wrestling game we wanted? Bye!